Welcome everyone to our first Stanford Woods Environmental Conversation for the 2017-2018 academic year. I'm Chris Field. I'm the director of the Woods Institute for the Environment, and I feel like I've been to several lifetimes worth of seminars, and one of the things that I'm interested in doing is opening channels of conversation, of communication that get to a different way of understanding big picture issues, a different way of understanding facts, and a different way of knowing people behind the scenes. And these environmental conversations are an investment in doing just that. During the course of the year, we'll have probably about 6 of these. The next one will be with Pam Matson, who's Lynn Orr's successor as the Dean of the School of Earth, Energy and Environmental Sciences. Super pleased to be able to start the series with a conversation with Lynn Orr, who has really done more than any other individual to make Stanford a center for where energy science, energy thinking is going on. Lynn started his career as a Stanford undergraduate, chemical engineering, and after doing a PhD and a short stint in the oil industry, he came back to Stanford in 1985, a professor of petroleum engineering, and is an expert on how fluids move through rocks, the physics of how fluids move through rocks, which is important if you want to get oil out, but it's also important if you want to put carbon dioxide in, or if you want to manage the energy system in a wide range of ways. But managing the energy system has always been Lynn's goal, much more than the fluid flow in rocks. And in 1994, he became the Dean of the School of Earth Sciences and really introduced a transition from hard rock petroleum engineering oriented program to one that really embraced the breadth of environmental sciences and started a transition to the broad-based school that we see today. And that wasn't enough, and beginning in 2002, he was the inaugural director of the Global Climate and Energy Program, which is a super ambitious effort to really put Stanford on the map as a place where energy happens. The GCEP passed out millions of dollars and created a whole generation of energy researchers working on everything from advanced photovoltaics through biomass. In fact, Lynn and I first started working together when I had a biomass project that was funded through the Global Climate and Energy Project. But the technology got really pushed by GCEP, and a critical realization was that there was more than just technology to creating an energy culture and an energy future. Lynn's next venture was as the founding director of the Precourt Institute for Energy, a position he took in 2009, and really started, instead of stitching together the materials of the energy transition, the culture of the energy transition with the construction of the transdisciplinary culture of energy science research. So once Stanford was on track to do energy right, Lynn took on a mantle on a slightly larger stage, and in 2014 he became the inaugural Undersecretary for Science and Energy in the U.S. Department of Energy, a position that was created by Ernie Moniz to really push the energy transition. And in that position, Lynn did an amazing range of things, from overseeing the science in most of the DOE national laboratories, orchestrating the DOE contributions to the historic Paris Agreement of 2015, stewarding the largest ever growth in wind and solar in the U.S., and really making the U.S. a leader in the energy transition. Lynn was elected to the U.S. National Academy of Engineering in 2000. He's been an influential member of the many boards and organizations, and is currently a member of the board of directors of the ClimateWorks Foundation, and has rejoined us at Stanford, where his work on not only making Stanford the leading institution for energy research, but making the energy transition to a non-climate forcing energy future a genuine possibility. So it's a genuine pleasure to have Lynn here today to kick off.
Can I rebut some of that? So, well, first of all, that litany convinces you that I couldn't hold down any one job for very long. But it neglected to mention the most important educational aspect of my early days at Stanford. My first job at Stanford was washing dishes for 300 people at Encina Commons. And my spouse claims that that's the single most useful thing I learned at Stanford University. So, it did bring home the idea that having multiple qualifications is a good thing.
And in the spirit of multiple qualifications, what should we be doing next at Stanford in order to really make the energy transition sustain the momentum that it has been building up throughout your career, but especially during the time you were in Washington?
Well, that's if I'd known there were going to be hard questions in this.
Well, what kind of dishes? What color were they?
So yeah, well, that is the central question. Next week is the GSEP symposium. It's the 15th one of these, and actually GSEP is going to change its format then. So I was asked to do a little thinking back to the beginning of the GSEP period. Sort of, it really was discussed a lot in 2001 and 2002, and in doing that, of course, it made me realize how much progress we have made in the last 15 years. It really is quite remarkable. Both the cost reductions for renewables like wind and solar, LEDs are down by 94% since 2008. I mean, there has been remarkable progress, and we can really see now, I think, how a pathway for decarbonizing electricity generation. It's harder for transportation and maybe harder still for the industrial applications. Transportation, of course, has the potential for electric vehicles. For urban kind of transportation, reductions in battery costs make a difference. And those, I think, will continue. As much as anything, we have to get to scale on things. And one of the reasons LEDs are down by a whole lot in prices that we've gotten to scale in manufacturing them, and smart manufacturers figure out better ways to do it. So on the transportation side, there's still the fuels for long haul, and then industrial processes, especially the ones that need high heat for processes, those are still harder to decarbonize. So I think from the university standpoint, the first thing we have to do is to continue to broaden the opportunity space. So if you look at things like, advanced materials apply in all kinds of areas. The combination of catalysis and nanostructured materials just offers a whole variety of ways to do things more efficiently. There's the whole grid management to manage renewables. I mean, there's just this really wide space of potential ways to make energy conversions more efficient, to use energy more wisely, and to do a better job of using the resources that we do use. Carbon capture and storage may or may not play a role. Lots to do on the technical side. But the technical side is not enough. We need to continue to drive down costs. Energy is supplied and used as a commodity, and cost really does matter. And you can see that already in the deployment of wind and solar. But continuing to drive down those costs will give us more options for flexibility and deployment in the future. But to do that, you have to think about how to get to scale in a variety of other ways. So energy finance, the regulatory picture, we have an extremely convoluted energy regulatory system. It's one thing for electricity, it's another thing for all the other energy resources. So the regulatory side, the congressional support and administration support for the enterprise that spans this big wide-ranging portfolio of both the technologies and the ways those get applied. There's so many good problems there that we need all the players we can get on the field and all the smart students we can to help us figure this out.
Let me follow up with a question about the scaling. I think that in the history of energy research, certainly the history of Stanford, the start of the GCEP project was a real turning point. And what did you say to companies like GE or Toyota or ExxonMobil back in 2000 to get them to really step up to the table and make the kind of commitments that they made that got us on this pathway?
Can I be quoted on this?
I
will tell you the truth. The truth is that we submitted a proposal to BP, the one that, and we didn't get it. Princeton got the carbon mitigation initiative there. But in the early version of that was largely an earth sciences outfit, a bunch of us thinking, but we brought them up to see
I remember that.
the CO2 experiment at Jasper Ridge. And in any case, we talked to Schlumberger then about a project that involved carbon capture and storage, but then they said, well, they'd like to do something, but it'd be good to have a partner. So Jerry Harris and I sat down and ran through a whole list of potential partners and got eventually to ExxonMobil, which I have to say we thought was probably low probability. But I called Michael Boskin, who was on the ExxonMobil board, and said, hey, this is what we're thinking about. What do you think? And he said, well, this was about 11 o'clock in the morning. He said, I'm leaving at 3 o'clock to go to a board meeting. Give me one page and I'll raise it with the chairman. Okay. Time. So that led me to, and I didn't quite get it in a page. It was a page and a quarter. And so we sent that off with him, and then shortly thereafter I got a call from a guy named Brian Flannery, who many of you know, and said they'd like to come visit. So they came and we put on a day of show and tell, and it was partly the carbon capture side, but it was partly other things that we were doing here at Stanford. And in the dinner that evening afterwards, Brian said, well, we're interested, but we really like the idea of a bigger, broader project with some more sponsors. Would you be interested? And so, not knowing exactly what I was getting into, I said, yes, we would be very interested in talking about that. So that then led to a very long series of conversations with other companies, with what we might do, and in the end, that was shaped into what was announced in the fall of 2002, which was a broad-ranging technology project aimed and focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions associated with energy use, but focused on the technology, and in a way that was willing to take some risk on things that were hard to support in the more risk-averse federal funding system, but had the potential for high payoff. So, the conversations throughout with all the companies these were all companies that had big, deep research functions, that had the long view, that were thinking on the multi-decade time scale. And I think all of them could see that the climate issue was one that's going to be with us for a long time, and that we needed to have as many technology options available as possible.
And would you say that it's the ability of a big university, a great university like Stanford, to kind of look out over the horizon that made them see added value beyond what their deep research organizations could already contribute? Or what was the secret that led them to commit?
Yeah, I think, well, as I said, all of these companies, Schlumberger, ExxonMobil, GE, and Toyota, all had their own deep commercial research organization. They didn't need us to do that. But they were focused on the nearer term things. They encouraged us to try to find ways to bring the most talented scientists and engineers around the campus, and indeed outside the campus, to work on these problems in ways that had the potential for breakthroughs that might be farther out. So yes, I think that was part of it. In some conversation, some participant wondered whether a joint project with another university might be a good thing, and Jeff Kosseff said, "We don't need no stinking whichever." And I, everybody laughed just as you did, but I think it conveyed the sense that we were ready to go tackle this with the resources that we had and wanted to do so. So I think that actually played a role.
I remember some pushback by environmental activists saying that this questionable, and maybe this investment is more about greenwashing than it is about solving energy problems. But I also think that the response to that is really critical for figuring out how we're going to solve the energy problem. And how did you think about dealing with that?
Well, we certainly did hear that, and there were some who worried that we'd just been bought by ExxonMobil. But what we did was to build a process that was proposal competition based. So we go do a workshop in a particular area and try and lay out a research agenda that made sense at the scale that we could fund and that were appropriate for a university setting. Did calls for proposal. They were to proposals from Stanford faculty, but also from institutions outside. And then we worked very hard on a peer review process that engaged experts around the technology world. The companies also looked at the proposals, but we took the reviews from all that, and then we came back and we formulated the funding pattern. The companies had to approve that, but for all the time, they always accepted what we said was, and we didn't always religiously follow the peer review. It turned out that when we talked about being risk averse, all of us trained in the normal proposal review process, you'd always get some reviewer would say, well, they haven't proved they can do this. But we were willing to say, look, we'll try not to violate the second law of thermodynamics, but if there's a plausible pathway and if a proof of concept experiment or analysis would help us see whether we really could do that at scale, we were willing to take that risk. So we tried to fill a niche that was not being filled with others. And in the end, what we said was, well, gosh, watch what we do. Everything will be public, and everything will be published if it's good enough to be published. And so I think looking back, then I think most would say that we were not.
I think that's undoubtedly true.
Guilty of greenwashing.
And without stealing the thunder from your GCEP talk in the GCEP symposium, what do you think the big take-homes were? And my sense is that GCEP probably more than anything else established the idea that we really need a portfolio of technologies. We need to think about grid integration and demand side management as well as the energy generation, and that we kind of transition from thinking about individual technologies to thinking about technology systems.
Yeah. Well, I think that was a transition for all of us as well. We we certainly, we concluded early on that if it doesn't take a huge amount of analysis to convince you that we kind of need all the tools we have now for reducing greenhouse gas emissions plus some more that we need to invent. And that what we wanted to work on was the invention side of that. And it did a couple of things. One, it stimulated a bunch of research here in the following way. So we did the proposal review based on three things. One was asking for high quality science or engineering science. Two, for a pathway for impact on greenhouse gas emissions, but it didn't have to be instant. We were willing to look beyond. And three, it needed to be step out in some sense. In other words, the Stanford is full of labs that are, among the best in the world at what they do. But what we didn't want to do was the next incremental part there, even though that's very important. It's an essential component of why universities are successful. But with the amount of money we had, seemed like a lot of money, but at the same time, $20 million a year is, it's small compared to the size of the challenge. So we wanted to try to focus that in ways that took some risks but had some potential benefits. And that had the impact, we never said to anybody that, gosh, you have to do interdisciplinary research. But the way people complied with the step out requirement was that they often banded together with some other research group to work on some problem that neither group thought they could pull off on their own, but where they thought they had a shot together. And then of course, in the review process, we provided lots of feedback from the reviews. And some things we funded first time around, some things went through a couple of rounds before they got funded. Some things never got funded, but the groups had such a good time working together on the stuff that they shined up the proposal, got it funded somewhere else. And so just the act of doing this, first of all, introduced all the players to each other. And second of all, it created some working relationships that really, I think were primarily successful because they were fun. And they allowed Stanford faculty to be pushing the boundaries of whatever it is they're working on. So the result of that was a much more visible research enterprise, energy research enterprise, with a lot of excitement around it because there were a lot of really good students and a lot of smart faculty working on it. So, and that helped us from the standpoint of sort of making all this be visible enough to help faculty members continue to raise money to work across the portfolio. And it also made us recognize, of course, as I said earlier, that the technology was one part of it, but it's not the only part.
Do you have a favorite project?
I love all my children, when I was at DOE, I was asked repeatedly which was my favorite national lab. Not going there.
I remember that the last several science talks that you and I had were about extinguishing a coal mine fire. I think it was in southern
yes.
Colorado, if I remember correctly. And
yeah.
Is that fire still burning, or did you get it out?
Well, it's actually a very interesting story, and the team that worked on that has reassembled. They're actually in the field at this very moment. So to set the stage a little bit for all of you, it turns out that around the world there are uncontrolled fires in underground coal beds. There was one in Colorado that we had an alum working for the Southern Ute Indian tribe who learned about this and just pestered me until I finally came to agree to go out and take a look at it. And it was so interesting that I found a student and we went to work. We threw every bit of geophysics we could at understanding how this works. And so to make a very long story short, basically what happens is lightning hits the outcrop where the coal is located. Once in a while it starts a fire that burns back in underground, and when it does, eventually you're converting coal into gas, and so the roof sags and collapses, and when that does, it makes cracks that opens the fractures that go up to the surface in the rocks above. That's now a chimney that draws oxygen, and the whole thing continues. So this fire had been going on for probably decades by the time we got to it. We looked, as I said, with lots of geophysics, most of which was not successful, but what was successful eventually was a sensitive magnetometer survey that allowed us to determine where the fire was underground and to see much more. And then we did a bunch of isotope work that convinced us that it was, part of it was burning coal, but part of it was natural gas flowing up from the coal bed methane areas down the San Juan Basin. So we then cooked up a way to put it out, hauled 20 tons of CO2 up there and did a test. And while we were looking at the isotope signatures of the CO2 and the combustion product gases, we then were able to show, that's how we showed that methane was an important part of sustaining this fire. Then the price of natural gas went down, and so the tribe was no longer willing to pay to connect us to the gas plant down the hill. But even so, they had at that time installed a bunch of vent wells to intercept some of the gas that was feeding that fire, and began processing that, got some credits for reducing methane emissions. And at the same time, then over time, the fire was much less active. So we're back up there now to see whether, and meanwhile, the student that did all this graduated, formed a company. He's working all over the world on doing, on assessing fires like this. And they've showed, he's learned that the presence of gas in the coal is a common situation. So we're really working now to try to see if we can establish quantitatively that effect as a way to both reduce greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane, and then also have a way to control these fires. So this was a good project in the sense that we started out with a complete misconception of how it worked, and Mother Nature explained to us that that wasn't right. And we learned a lot in the process, and then it's led to a company that's working on it, and with a chance of doing something more around the world.
Speaking of gas, you know, one of the big topics in energy research has been how natural gas serves as a bridge to renewables or not. And do you want to talk about how you see that and how in the DOE you thought about it?
Yeah, well, I can. This is something I've spent lots of time thinking about. If you look at what's happened in this country over the last 8 years, coal has gone from roughly 50% of the electric power generation to about a third now, 34% the last time I looked. And natural gas has taken up the difference. And the reason has been that the abundance of natural gas from the combination of long-reach horizontal wells and hydraulic fracturing in shales has made lots of gas available and has reduced the price. So there's been a market move to reduce the cost of generation at the same time that there was environmental pressure, particularly on the oldest coal-fired power plants. Mercury rules and the pollution controls on those plants have made them expensive to operate, particularly the oldest ones. And so there's been a real shift. The capital cost of a new gas plant is quite a lot lower than a new coal plant, and right now no coal plants are being financed in the United States. So you say, well, does this matter? Yes, it does matter, because if you replace an old 33% efficient coal-fired power plant with a 60% combined cycle gas plant where there's less carbon in the fuel per unit of energy in the fuel, the reduction is almost 70% in the CO2 per kilowatt hour. So that's a big step, and that's been an important component in the reductions in CO2 emissions the United States have seen so far. But of course, it still is a fossil fuel. So, and methane is a pretty powerful greenhouse gas. So you want to, if we're going to do this, continue to do this, you want to get after the leaks and the fugitive emissions in a good, strong way. And then you still have to think about, well, what happens as we get farther down the road, and we really need to get somewhere by mid-century to much bigger reductions. And that's the trade-off. Carbon capture and storage is possible with natural gas. Natural gas has played a role already in firming the supplies of renewables. In California now, there's a lot of solar power generation in the middle of the day, but as the sun gets low in the horizon in the late afternoon, and the solar generation rolls off and the wind resource is typically bigger at night, they need to ramp power generation by as much as 10,000 or 13,000 megawatts. So, you know, that's over a couple of hour period. So you can do that with a gas turbine. It's a little slower in a combined cycle setting, but having that back up to the intermittency, it's changed is important. It's changed the economics because those gas plants are not running as much, and so they have to recover their costs as well. So this interplay of multiple generation sources and potential longer-term carbon capture and storage offers a potential role for natural gas, but it's one that has to be managed carefully. I think on balance that we should use that market lever to continue to reduce the fraction of coal in the mix. There are just so many health and other benefits to doing that we should do that, but it doesn't relieve us from the responsibility of working out what happens farther downstream.
Would you say that even if natural gas in some settings probably slows the transitions to renewable, that getting rid of coal is in some sense worth it, that having a powerful lever to pry coal out of the system?
Well, yeah, I think if it's solely, if we have to depend on some combination of regulatory limits or, for now, a carbon price, the market is a more effective lever right now in our current market structure.
Let me ask one more question, and then I want to open up to input from everybody. And I wonder if you want to just paint a picture of where you think we're going to be in 2030 and 2050, and what needs to happen that is preventing us from getting there now?
How many things can I list?
All right. Well, everybody's got their list ready to write down. So they're all going to hop on it.
So I'll divide what I say into what I hope and then what I think will actually happen. What I hope we'll do is to, as a country and as a world, recognize the potential benefits of a clean, diversified energy system that is climate friendly at the same time that it provides abundant low-cost energy for us and for others around the world. I think the reasons for doing that are they're partly international competitiveness, economies that use energy wisely and efficiently and at reasonable cost will be economically competitive. It's a national security issue, and it's also a climate and environment issue. Now, we're not all the way there in terms of acceptance of how much we need to work on this, particularly in this country, but it's mixed around the world. Europe is farther along than we are. China has changed dramatically in the last dozen years. It's really quite remarkable what's happened there, but they have a way to go too. And then some of the other developing countries, India is a little farther behind, but is beginning to show some signs of making progress. So and my realistic answer is that I think we this will be slower than we would like, but I do think we'll get there. If you just look at the last 10 years, there's been such progress. And if you think about the Paris Agreement, it's voluntary, it's nationally determined contributions, and they don't get us all the way there by any means. But gosh, if you think what happened after Kyoto and Copenhagen, you know, it's a step along the way, and so we just need to work. We need to work across the portfolio, both timescales and you know, energy resources and the ways we convert them, and then the structures, the markets and regulatory structures in which they operate, and plug away at it. This has always been, we've known it's a multi-decade deal, and so we need to stick with that. Will we be at an 80% reduction in 2050? That'll be a challenge. I don't know that we necessarily will, but if we're close, it's a heck of a lot better than if we say, oh, it's hopeless. So we just, yeah. And I'll give you an existence proof. So in the middle 60s, we were having this debate about air and water quality. And I can tell you, as a kid growing up in Houston, air quality was at times pretty bad there, and LA and Pittsburgh, and you know, think back to what in those days when you landed in LA, chances were you couldn't see the wingtip on the airplane. You know, it's like going to Beijing now. And so, to oversimplify a very long and complicated story, you know, California put some rules in place. Some other states went along, and pretty soon industry was in Washington saying, 50 sets of rules, not okay. You know, give us some rules, we'll comply. Republican president, Republican Congress, Clean Air Act passed, Clean Water, Federal Water Pollution Control Act passed. And here we are 47 years later. We haven't solved every problem, but gosh, it's a lot better than it was. And I think even the most diehard regulatory folks don't want to go back to the air that we had in LA in those days. So, and if you think about what worked, it was that we set ourselves some goals, made some rules, went to work on it, and then steadily chipped away at it over time, and we're a lot better off now than we were then. This is where China and India are now, and they're making the same kinds of decisions. Climate is harder. It's not a strictly equivalent parallel because you know, you could see and feel in your eyes the air pollution issues in a way that you don't feel the radiative forcing part of climate change as easily. But at the same time, you know, the evidence is continuing to pile up. So I guess my hopeful side says that will convince us, and then in the meantime we need to work on efficiency in every possible way and continue to build a portfolio of options going forward.
Great. So now I did my part. Now it's up to you guys to uncover the real story. So questions for Lynn?
I already told the real story.
Charlie. Oh, wait for the microphone, please, since we need a detailed record of your of the sophisticated question you're about to ask.
So sophisticated. Spoiler alert. What are the prospects for liquid or solid forms of carbon in sequestration?
Yeah. So, well, liquid. You know, all it takes is low temperature and high pressure to make a liquid. It's not all that high. If you inject CO2 into the subsurface, usually the temperature is above CO2's critical temperature, but the densities are liquid-like. So all the places where you use CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, it might as well be a liquid density. It's just, but it's not a liquid, it's supercritical fluid. In terms of solid, now you're talking dry ice basically if it's at room temperature.
Like limestone?
Oh, so yeah, okay. Okay, sure. Well, yeah, that is actually what Mother Nature does, is to make limestone precipitates. You can do that in terms of doing it at a scale with which that might apply for carbon mitigation. There's a group, Klaus Lochner has led a group for a long time that's argued in favor of doing this. It requires mining large quantities of the stuff you're going to react the CO2 with, and the energy requirements of mining, and to get the reaction rates to go at a reasonable rate, you have to grind up the rock and do the reactions, and that's energetically expensive, and you generate big volumes. So right now, from a cost standpoint, I don't see how that makes much of a dent in the systems. The one place where there's some recent evidence that might help is in basalts. So there was an experiment done in Iceland recently where they injected CO2 into the warm brine-filled rocks, basalts there. And they had some evidence that it reacted actually quite quickly into solid minerals that, now you have to worry about whether or not you're passivating the fractures in a way that makes it hard to continue to inject, but apparently that was not a problem, at least in the short-term tests. So not out of the question. That one's a long way from being ready to do at scale.
Could you summarize your DOE career in a way similar to your summary on GSEP, and how did you leave things and what next?
So, summarize my DOE career. Well, so on the positive side, you know, what I liked best about being dean here was the mandate to stick my nose in everybody's research. Boy, did I have a lot of research to stick my nose into at DOE, because certainly on the fundamental science side, I can tell you I know a lot more about neutrinos now than I did when I went to DOE. The last time I studied particle physics, before that, I think neutrinos hadn't been discovered yet. So in any case, but there's some really, I won't go into all the details, but so the combination of fusion, the high energy physics and nuclear physics in the Office of Science, basic energy sciences, gee, there's such interesting work going on there in terms of batteries and catalysis, and the combination of nanostructured materials and catalysts, and just the ability to control properties of materials in ways that we really couldn't even contemplate a few years back. That was wonderfully interesting. On the applied side, the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy had lots of cool stuff going on. Some more batteries there for transportation applications. Lots of energy efficiency work. The stuff that really pays off in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in the near term is energy efficiency. And in fact, I will tell a story about this. So the Energy Policy Act of 2007, I think it was, put in some requirements that DOE regulate the efficiency of lighting. But they put in a stopgap provision that I'll explain in a minute, but that comes back at the end of the story. So DOE happily went to work on all of this. But then the Congress decided and put in our appropriations bills that we were not allowed to spend any money on assessing the efficiency value of things that would get rid of incandescence. But the Energy Policy Act put in a stopgap provision that if we didn't act to regulate, it would put in some standards that would require the use of LEDs or something like them. So at the very end, we were not allowed to do, we looked at the idea, could we just use market data that was all published, so we didn't have to do any work to do this. And in the end, we decided, no, we probably couldn't do that either. And so we just did not do the required regulation because we couldn't comply with the law. But that kicked in the stopgap provision. And there was a question of whether the Congress could do the Congressional Review Act to stop that, but they didn't do it. And it was a big reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that will take place as those standards come into place. Now, Congress can still change it, but it takes, I mean, they have to go through the whole bill and that sort of. So energy efficiency was in there, lots of work on the renewables. We cooked up some new goals for the Sunshot Initiative to get us to 3 cents a kilowatt hour by 2030. We worked on LNG exports and how to streamline the approval process. We did a new science integrity policy for DOE. We did a quadrennial technology review that looked at every energy technology known to man and thought about where the research opportunities were. So we did a lot of stuff. And I was really proud of the team that worked on all of this, and I worry about the career folks that are in a different situation now. Did we solve every problem? Of course not. This is a big thing to do. Our teams worked hard on supporting the Paris Initiative. Our teams in other settings worked hard on supporting the Iran agreement. The national labs that were in my part of the agency. The team, Ernie Moniz and the team would be in Vienna talking to the day, and the Oak Ridge and PNL lab teams would then work while they were sleeping there, would be working here to try to be ready for them the next day. So the days were astonishingly varied. They were scheduled every single second. So that took some getting used to. But I would say, on the whole, I thought it went pretty well. I wasn't particularly good at the congressional side, but fortunately, Secretary Moniz was so good at that, they wanted him and not me. So that was good. Now, since then, of course, the administration that's come in has indicated that they want to do much less in this area. The president's budget involved deep cuts to the Department of Energy. So far, at least, the Congress has not gone along with that, so we'll see what happens there. But it was a hugely interesting experience, and I'm very glad to be here.
Do you want to comment on the people at DOE and what's happening with folks and the kind of overall morale status?
Yeah, well, it's kind of been a tough time. It really started as part of the transition. You know, we did this huge amount of work to prepare for the transition. The White House asked that all the agencies do as much as we could to make the transition be a smooth one, to provide information about, you know, what work gets done and every aspect of what we did. And we did a nice layered set of overviews with deeper dives to each of the pieces, and they were all ready. Transition team, when it came in, listened to the overviews and then kind of disappeared. So they chose not to engage in a deep way, and that I think turns out to be because at least the people that were involved there really thought that there should be a much smaller government role that it was okay to do the science work, but that the applied programs were not appropriate. This should be done by industry. So they were not very interested in that part of it because they didn't want to continue it. So So that led to, and they cleared out my office. The politicals, of course, we all went on January 20th, but they sent everybody else back to their homes. It's a time where, people are unsettled and they're worried about, whether they'll have jobs, and the president's budget would lead to maybe 6,500 job losses at the national labs if it went through. So that's enough to get people's attention. They haven't yet. They have a confirmed secretary and deputy now, but they don't have undersecretaries. Well, they have one of the 3 undersecretaries for the nuclear weapons side of things is still there, but the other positions are unfilled, and none of the assistant secretary positions are filled either. So there's kind of a vacuum in leadership at that point now. So, it's a tough time.
Catherine.
So to ask a really obvious follow-up question, how do you see the most important opportunities and priorities across actors, internationally, subnationally, private sector, university, to keep momentum up even as the national dimensions flag?
Oh, that's another one of those hard questions. Gee whiz. Yeah. Well, I think this is a place where the portfolio part of this still works. That having, I think universities have a really important part to play, but not the only part. The NGO community is an important player here. In the United States, the states and regions and localities have important roles to play. I mean, California is a really important actor in all of this now, and I think that has some downsides because we're not working at the federal level the way we should. But at the same time, it's going to allow some experimentation at the state level that I think will be interesting to watch and from which we'll learn things. So. I think we just need to keep pushing on in as many directions as we can simultaneously, and to try to illuminate what will happen if we don't take action, and what the costs of those options are, even as we look at the costs of all the other options that we do work on. So there's no shortage of things to do, that's for sure.
I saw hands from Ross, Noah, and Gordon. Would you be okay if I take all 3 of those questions and you can kind of weave them together? Or
I can ignore the parts I don't want to answer?
Okay, well, so Gordon and Noah. Gordon.
Lynn, given that we have not yet solved the problem of nuclear waste disposal in this country, what is your forecast for the future of nuclear energy as an energy source?
Well, there's another tough one. So we tried, there was the Blue Ribbon Commission, which Secretary Moniz was a member of that commission. So we tried to put in place a process to implement what they suggested, which was largely some sort of consent-based siting process. Congress restricted the amount of money that we had to be able to do this, so we could only do part of it. We did a round of workshops this last year to try to look for what would need to be elements of a consent-based signing process. That's now been really put on hold, I think, although it's a little unclear. And so we're still in the kind of stalemate that we were in before, where Yucca Mountain was the only remaining option, and the state of Nevada is basically able to prevent Yucca Mountain from functioning by restricting access and restricting water and things like that. Now, Senator Reid was an opponent of that, and he's no longer in office. So whether that will change, I don't know. One thing we do need to do is to ask ourselves carefully, is storing spent nuclear material at 100 well, it used to be 130 places, but I think it's 110 or something like that. It's not no longer quite, but it's still a lot. That is that, I mean, are the risks of that worse than the risks of some of the other things we could do? I hope that we will restart that process. But there are a lot of impediments, and so if you ask me to say what I think will happen in the near term, it will be the continued stalemate that we have now. That's not the preferred option.
Noah?
Yeah, so on the theme of scale, reflecting on your answer to Charlie's question, there's a whole quiver full of magic arrows that get put out that, well, if we could just bury all the CO2, if we could just run everything on nuclear, if it was all solar, it would only take this much of the earth and there's so much sunshine, why don't we just do that? So how do you see, going back to Chris's question of kind of, 2030, 2040, 2050, how do you see the pie? What's your sense of, are there some of these solutions that you think, oh boy, in 2050, that's still just going to be a sliver, or oh boy, if we could just really unlock this other one, that could really be a big wedge? Kind of where do you see the top three that are likely and unlikely?
Well, I think we've made enough progress on renewables that now you can see that wind and solar are going to be big players. I think we've made enough progress on batteries that a reasonable fraction of transportation, particularly urban settings, can be electrified. And in fact, I think it's likely that we will continue to electrify services of all kinds because they're so much more flexible. And so that really puts part of the onus on decarbonizing the electricity system, which we talked about quite a bit. There are some parts of this that are hard. I know people are talking about flying airplanes around using batteries, but I don't know, I'm a pilot and I just don't see how they're going to get the weight stuff sorted out for that. So now I'm going to get out my magic, my arrow for the magic quiver. If we can continue, if we meet the 2030 sunshot goal and can get solar PV down in the 2 to 3 cents a kilowatt hour range, then you can afford another thermodynamic transition there. So in my magic list of wished for devices, there's one that does electrochemistry that takes those clean solar electrons, reduces CO2. You can argue about whether we take that out of the air or whether we use higher concentration sources. But anyway, you reduce CO2 and make a carbon-carbon bond. So you basically can make a liquid fuel that has less fossil carbon in it, and a lot less fossil carbon. Because that gives you options for airplanes and ships and long-haul trucking to some extent. The other option, of course, people like the idea of negative CO2 emissions. So there's an option there with growing biomass and then doing CCS. I've spent a lot of time in my career working on CCS kind of stuff, and I just see it as a player, but not at this kind of scale that you put all your eggs in that basket. That just seems not feasible to me, just for all the other things that have to happen to get a big project in place. I think there is potential, if you're going to capture CO2 out of the air, then what you'd like is a solar-powered device that self-assembles. And you go, wait, we have those. We call them plants. And so You can ask whether or not you can enhance that part of it. There's all the trade-offs with food and land use and all that kind of stuff. And soil carbon, I think those can contribute. I get driven pretty fast back to the portfolio aspect of this, of really having a wide range of options, some of which work in some places and some of which don't in others. I note that I have carefully dodged your question about which were the top three and how big the wedges were. And the reason for that is that I don't know the answer. So.
Well, does anybody want to ask a final question? If not, I do. Okay, go ahead.
Wait for the mic.
Please wait for the mic.
To reduce the costs or reduce CO2. By doing that, actually, we increase the consuming of energy or anything. But should we really change the human behavior, by reducing consuming energy? Because I think for the last 20 years, the U.S., the air quality is better, but China is suffering.
Yeah.
But in the future, it's going to transfer to other countries also.
Yeah.
It's really because we move the manufacturing to Asia, to China, to other countries, right? So should we, my question is really, should we, really study the human behavior, the consuming behavior? We should really watch on that. That's a major impact on the environmental issue. It's not just energy, it's everything.
I agree completely. The consumer choices and human behavior, they have a huge impact on what happens going forward. And we have to think about supplying energy to the developing world in a way that, you can do a lot better than we do, but it's not okay to say you have to stay without use of energy. So my DOE experience, of course, some parts of the Congress viewed any behavioral research as some sort of social engineering, and they did not like that idea. So we didn't do any behavioral research at DOE. We did do some decision science that looked at how people decided what to do. Who knows what? But no, your point is one that really matters, and it would be good if we understood how to align the incentives for individuals to do the right thing with regard to the way they use energy, because it provides them with lots of benefits. And we know, for example, on the energy efficiency side, gosh, we have left ourselves huge room to do better in this country, and we don't really do it for the most part. So you go, well, why is that? It's in our economic interest, it's in our health interest. Why don't we do that? And we need to understand that better, and then figure out a way to make that part do well. So I just basically, in a long-winded way, agreed with everything you said.
Well, let me close with one thought. And I started off mentioning it. I think there's probably nobody who has done more to transition Stanford to thinking creatively about tackling the energy challenge than you have. And when we come back to the people part of it, it's really clear that how you organize individuals, how you set goals, how you provide incentives is really important. And what do you think we in the university should be doing now in order to continue to move the ball down the field? We've made a lot of progress, but there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true, and I don't have any magic formula for that. Having, I have to say, a totally reliable joke at DOE was one where I said, gosh, I've had 25 years of trying to manage in an academic setting where nobody ever did anything, no faculty member ever did anything because the department chair or dean or president or provost or institute director told them to. And that was good practice for the federal government. They always laughed. It was, as I say, a totally reliable joke. But if you think about what motivates students and faculty here at Stanford, working on on very challenging problems where they can do something that really matters is something that, you know, our team likes to do that. So part of the job is to help people understand where the challenges are and where there's an opportunity to take that piece of science that you hadn't really thought about as applying to energy, in other words, to motivate the team, even if, and to be honest, it helps to have some bait. And what we had with GCEP, and to a smaller extent with the Precourt Institute, and the Woods Institute has had this as well, is some potential for funding that entices people into working on hard stuff and gives them room to not have to not do in the end exactly what they proposed, because it turned out that you needed to take a turn at and you know, it's like my coal fire, where Mother Nature explained to me that what I thought was not right, and we had to do something different. So creating a system in which it's okay to do that, and where we can band together with our fellow faculty members to work on something that really matters. That's kind of the only way I can see to do it. And having the kind of talent we have around this place is a big help in pulling that off. And I would say, by the way, that one thing he said was just wrong, and that was that he's giving me way too much credit for all the good stuff that's happened here. It's been done by the community as a whole, by responding in a big way to the challenge that we all recognize as an important one. So it's very much a shared endeavor, not due to me.
Well, except for the inappropriate modesty attack at the last minute, please join me in thanking Lynn Orr for a really spectacular conversation.